Well, good morning, everyone. It is a privilege to get to pastor and lead in this church. Certainly, we have many more who are part of our staff that just make our life easier, and honestly, to be able to lead this church in particular is really the best gift ever. However, if you do have points and miles just laying around, I would be happy to take those off of Brant. You got some extra, right? Yeah. All right. No, seriously, we have an amazing staff, amazing support staff, amazing directors and leaders, and they just do an amazing job. It's not just us. We're going to jump in this morning. We are in a series on the I am statements of Jesus, 7 different statements that Jesus makes in the Gospel of John. And so we're going to jump in to today's I am statement. We believe in a miracle-working God. Amen? That we still believe that God does miracles today. You guys are a little less enthusiastic about the fact that we still believe in a miracle-working God, but it's okay. First service, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't tell first service I said this, but they were quiet. They were so dead this morning. Not literally dead, but it was just like, come on, you guys. This message is a little bit of a heavier message, and so. Like the first part is the lightest part of the message, and so if I can't get you in the first part, it's going to be a long morning. Okay, so everybody just take a deep breath and lighten up. But we throw this word miracle around a lot, don't we? We kind of use it pretty flippantly in our vocabulary today. Even though we do believe in a miracle-working God, we say things like, it's going to take a miracle for the Texas Longhorns to come back from that big of a deficit, right? Or it's going to be, it'll be a miracle if the Oregon Ducks are 7-0 at this point in the season, which we are, and probably going to be the new number 1, just FYI, which is a miracle, honestly. No, we use this word a lot, like it's going to take a miracle for me to land that job. It's going to take a miracle. There's even movie titles. I mean, there's a pretty famous movie called Miracle. And it's about the U.S. hockey team, beating the Russians, and it was this whole big thing. It wasn't a miracle. It was just good preparation. It was just good execution. It wasn't really a miracle. There's actually over 150 titles of movies with the word miracle in it. Can you believe that? Most of them are Hallmark Channel movies. They're almost all of them. But there is Miracle on 34th Street, which I've never seen. I was thinking about that as I was writing my message. I'm like, I've never seen that movie. And so I had to actually look up the premise of Miracle on 34th Street. I know, it's like, am I even American? But it wasn't a miracle in the movie, I don't think. It was coincidence. But believe it or not, the I am statement that we're going to talk about has to do with a miracle. And we are now just over 6 months. Anybody know what we're 6 months from? Anybody? April. Good. So what would that be? What? Fiesta. Yes, fiesta. Anything else big in the Christian world? No, it's my birthday, April 27th. No, Easter. Of course, it's Easter. And yes, it's also fiesta, which is big in San Antonio. Listen, rarely do we talk about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus outside of Easter. Right? Typically, we just kind of reserve like the best messages for Easter. And I was like, okay, we're at the halfway point from last Easter to next Easter. And I think it'd be good, especially since we're in the I am statement of Jesus stating that he is the resurrection and life, to talk about that. If ever there was the definition of a miracle, it is a dead man whom everybody saw die, walking out of a grave after 3 days, and then after 40 days ascending before their eyes into heaven. When we talk about the word miracle or we say miraculous, there is no greater definition than that. And it's an outrageous claim. But if it's true, if Jesus really did die, and then 3 days later rise again, and then 40 days later ascend into heaven, if that is true, it changes everything. If Jesus' resurrection actually happened, then your sins, my sins, can be forgiven. Disastrous decisions that we've made that have derailed our life don't have to define our life anymore. And death is not the end. If the tomb is empty, anything is possible. There's a story of an elderly couple that gets thrown around among pastors and churches all the time, and it's about this elderly couple who go on a trip to Israel for a tour. And they're in the Holy Land, and they're on this tour, but this is kind of one of those cantankerous couples that they're just fighting all the time. They're arguing with one another. He's making rude comments about his wife, and unfortunately what happens is while they're on their tour, the man dies. And so the wife has to now deal with getting her husband back to the U.S., and so she goes and meets with the undertaker and asks him if he could help her ship her husband's body home. And he said, yes, ma'am, I can. I don't know if he said ma'am, but he wasn't from the South. So he says it'll cost you around $7,000. But the undertaker says, I could bury him right here in the Holy Land for only $250. And she said, no, it's okay. I'll ship him back. The undertaker said, I don't understand. Like, a lot of people love this option. You could bury him right here in the Holy Land, the land of Jesus and the apostles and the prophets, and you could save over $6,000. And she said, yes, but 2,000 years ago, a man was buried here, but he didn't stay dead. And I just don't think I want to take that chance. It's not really a true story, but it does raise the question, doesn't it? Like, how is an empty grave in an obscure Middle Eastern town relevant to us 2,000 years later? John chapter 11, if you have your Bibles, as I said, for the last several weeks, we've been looking at the 7 different times in the Gospel of John that Jesus takes this loftiest of names. He takes the name I am, right? Jehovah, and he claims it for himself. He says, I am, and then he adds these descriptors to it. And what makes these claims so significant to us today is that each time Jesus takes on the name of God, he applies it to one of the most acute places of felt need. For example, those who are hungry, he says, I am the bread of life. Right? For those who are in darkness, he says, I am the light. To those who feel lost, he says, I am the door. Every I am claim that Jesus makes in John starts with a human problem. And so today we come to what is undoubtedly the ultimate human problem, death. To which Jesus says in John chapter 11, verse 25, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Death, or the fear of death, would have to be among our most acute felt needs. Death is one of those ever-present realities for us that we can sometimes manage to ignore. We can kind of keep it at bay until we can't, until we're faced with it. But as the death rate in our world is still holding steady at 100%, it is just something eventually that we all will face. Eventually, death takes us from everyone and everything that we hold dear. And some of you have felt that sooner than you ever should. And Jesus' claim addresses this theology, if you will, or this idea of death. But I want to look at another thing, and I want to highlight another felt need that this claim addresses. By the way, I just want to point out that as Christians, as church people, as Christ followers, we're not really good about talking about death. In fact, in first service, I'm just going to acknowledge one of the questions that came up in first service as people were texting in questions, and one that I addressed with everyone, that there has been historically a theology around death that says that if a person who has surrendered their life to Jesus, a committed Christian, has followed their life with Christ, has taken their life, that they will be damned to hell. And I just want to point out that that's simply not true. That's not true. There are people who have experienced enormous amount of chronic illness and pain and depression that has been chemical depression and medication where they are committed Christians but end up taking their life. Is that the intent for that person? Like, was that God's plan for their life? Absolutely not. Does it cause a lot of pain and destruction for the people who were left behind? Absolutely, and I've seen it time and time again. But I just want to make sure that we all are on the same page, that when we are talking about death, that for those who might be thinking about someone who has taken their life, as was in first service, a dear friend, that they've always been wondering whether or not they would ever see their friend again. And the answer to that is yes. If you are a believer, it is not the unpardonable sin. It is not an unpardonable thing. So we have this bad theology. We don't like talking about it as Christians. And I think there's something about us that, like, just as Christ followers, we're faced with this eternal decision and all of these things, and we struggle with it. I want to highlight, though, this other felt need that Jesus' claim addresses, because it's something almost all of us have felt at some point. And I would argue probably all of us. And sometimes it goes along with death, and that is disappointment with God. Right? It's another thing we don't really like to talk about. We don't like to talk about those feelings and emotions that we have towards the God of the universe. I mean, like, a deep, unsettling question about why God didn't do something that you thought he should have done. It just didn't make any sense. You prayed, you believed, you trusted in him, you did all of the things that you were supposed to do, but God didn't seem to do his part. That person still died. The marriage still disintegrated. You didn't get the job. The child hasn't returned. Like, you just don't understand why God isn't doing his part. And maybe you're not even sure how to think about all of that anymore. That if God is loving, like you've always been taught, we know that God is love, why didn't he help you in your moment of crisis? Where was he for you? And yeah, you're here this morning, but honestly, you're not even sure how much you believe this stuff anymore. Let me tell you a story about a guy named Ted Turner. Maybe that name will be familiar to some of you that are over 30. Ted Turner founded CNN and TBS, and he's a media mogul, multi-billionaire. And when Ted Turner was in high school, he was on fire for Jesus. Not many people know that, but he was. In fact, he felt called to be a missionary. But when he was 15, his younger sister, Mary Jane, at age 12, contracted lupus, a degenerative tissue disease. And for the next several years, he watched as she basically wasted away. Ted would regularly come home from school, sit by her bed, hold her hand, and try to comfort her. He prayed for her recovery, but after several years of misery, she died. Ted's dad, Ed Turner, the family's spiritual anchor, said, "If that's the type of God he is, then I want nothing to do with him." And when Ted saw his dad's faith crumble, Ted eventually lost his own faith. He said in an interview years later, "I was taught that God was love and God was powerful, and I couldn't understand if that was true, how someone so innocent should be allowed to suffer like that." It's hard to hear, isn't it? It's hard to read as I read that story, but my guess is that there is a number of us who have experienced some of those same questions, some of those same thoughts. This story in John 11 starts with a question many of us have asked at some point in our lives. Jesus, if you really love me, like I've always been taught, why didn't you show up when? Where were you when? How can I trust after this? Here's how the story goes. Lazarus, Jesus' friend, got sick. Now, Jesus loved everybody, but he was especially close to Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. He had this deep personal connection with them. Some scholars say that they believe that they grew up as childhood friends. And they believed, these friends believed in him, and they supported his ministry. They were very, very close to Jesus. It quickly became obvious that this was no ordinary sickness that Lazarus had, and it was so sick or so serious that Martha sent for Jesus. By this point, Jesus had this reputation that he was healing people. He was doing miracles, right? He healed this man of blindness. He made this other man who was paralyzed and lame walk. He even raised a little girl up from the dead. But it was also true that Jesus didn't heal every sick person in Israel. In fact, he seemed to be rather selective in who he healed, almost as if he had an agenda, almost as if his agenda was not to end every disease, but at least not yet, but his agenda was to show some things that he wanted to teach people about himself through these miracles. And yet, they thought, surely if Jesus would heal anybody, it would be his longtime friend Lazarus. So Martha sends for Jesus, says, "Jesus, hurry, it's urgent. Our brother doesn't have long. Please come immediately." And then they waited, and they waited, and they waited, but Jesus never showed. And Lazarus dies. And maybe most confusingly about this story that we find out that Jesus' delay was actually intentional. In verse 6, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. He hears about Lazarus being sick, and he's like, yeah, I'm just going to hang here. Those statements, they don't even make sense together. You'd expect it to say, now Jesus loved Martha and Mary, so when he heard Lazarus was ill, he immediately rushes there to be with them and to make it all better. That's not what it says. It says he loved them, so he stayed. In fact, when his disciples saw that he delayed going, they couldn't understand it either. And when they found out that Lazarus was dead, they were like, Jesus, what in the world? What are you doing? How can you not go? How can you not answer that call? And his response in verse 15 was, for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. And here's the central question of this entire story. Believe what? What is it about himself that he wants people to believe about him? If we take a look at this, there's something so important that Jesus wants them to believe that he's going to let one of his friends die and let the hearts of that guy's sisters just temporarily be broken so that the disciples could understand and believe something about Jesus. And by the way, who is the you in the story, right? Who is the you that Jesus is thinking about in this sentence? It's not just you, the disciples, that are there in the midst of the story. It's the you that is us. It's us. It's Lifehouse. It's anybody who will listen. It's those who are seeking after Jesus. And he's going to let the events of this story go down a certain way for those of us, those of you, the you in the story who have ever had a moment where you said, "Where are you, God? Why haven't you come?" He's doing it for you believers who are trying to hold on to faith even though you're pretty disappointed in God right now. And he's doing it for those of you who have lost your faith, who used to believe in God until the bitterness of life has crushed it out of you. He let this story play out a certain way so that you might believe. Here's how it goes down. By the time Jesus finally gets there, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. He's long since been put in the grave. Martha hears that Jesus is on his way, and so she runs out to meet him. And when she sees him, she verbalizes the thought that everybody was thinking, and maybe some of us are thinking today. "Lord," verse 21, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." In other words, why didn't you show up, Jesus? You could have shown up. We did what we were supposed to do. We've been loyal to you when others absolutely departed from you. We stayed faithful to you. Why didn't you show up for us? My question to you is, have you ever asked that question? I would argue that I think we all have at one point in time. There's something in our human nature to question, to have those kinds of questions. And listen, this is what I want you to hear this morning is Jesus doesn't condemn us for feeling that way. He says, "I know you felt that way." Tim Keller, who pastored for years in New York City, preached on this passage in particular on the Sunday after the 9/11 attacks. Dr. Keller said that Jesus in this story shows us 4 things about himself that he wants us to hold on to in any tragedy. Those 4 things are tears, anger, truth, and grace. So we're going to walk through those together. The first is tears. When Jesus saw the grief of Mary and Martha, what does he do? In verse 35, it's the shortest verse in all of the Bible. If you ever got extra credit or got some sort of prize for memorizing Scripture as a child, you memorized this verse. Anybody know? Jesus wept. It just simply says, Jesus wept. The Son of God who placed the stars in the sky wept with 2 broken-hearted sisters. To be honest, Jesus' tears here almost feel a little confusing, don't they? Right? Verse 4 tells us that he already knew what was going to be the outcome of this whole situation before he ever left for their home. So it's like, why is he crying with them now? I was telling First Service that, man, since I've become a lead pastor, it wasn't even just as a youth pastor or an associate pastor, but when I became a lead pastor, there was something that shifted in me where now I am very much a sympathetic crier. It didn't used to be this way. I used to be able to keep it together and sometimes people are like, "Do you have any emotions?" But then I became a lead pastor, and something about the weight of that and seeing people that I'm responsible for weeping and crying, it just, even just talking about it, it makes me tear up. And my wife will attest to this. She sees it all the time as we walk with people, and she here's what happens. The person across the room will start tearing up and start getting emotional, and she immediately looks to me and she's like, it's okay. You're going to be okay. And she comforts me. I'm like, do you not have any emotions? But there's something about this picture of Jesus coming to these women who he knows the outcome, but yet he still cries with them. He still weeps with them. I'm a fixer. Like, and when someone comes to me with a problem or they're going through something, it's hard for me to just sit with people in their brokenness. Yes, I will get a little emotional, but it will always be followed by answers. Let me help you with this. Let me fix this problem. Have you tried this? Have you done that? It's hard for me just to sit with people in their darkness, in their brokenness, and weep with them and not try to solve all of their problems. And yet Jesus is here and he shows up and he knows that in just a few moments, all of what they're weeping over and they're crying over is going to be resolved. But he just takes some time to cry with them. And the reason is so that you may believe. It's because Jesus wants us to understand how he feels about you in your pain. Even when Jesus knows the pain is temporary, he knows what it feels like for you, and he weeps with you. If we're being honest, 100 years to Jesus is as much as 10 minutes. He knows the outcome. It means Jesus can already see the beautiful resolution to our story, and he can already feel that beautiful moment when you are reunited to lost loved ones. And all of the sad things in our life become untrue, and Scripture tells us he wipes away every tear. He can feel that like it's already here. He knows it in his soul, in his being. But in that moment, the Son of God still weeps. And it's because his heart is knit to ours. He feels deeply what we feel, much like we feel deeply when one of our children get hurt. My son, when he was 2 years old, when we lived in Spokane, he was running around outside, and all of a sudden he trips and he just face plants right into a concrete curb. And he cracks one of his teeth, the other one he knocks out. He's bloody. He's a mess. He's a mess. As a parent, you feel that pain. Some of you aren't even his parent, and you feel it. You know that pain. You cry with them. You want to fix it. You can't fix it. Only the dentist could fix that. By the way, he grew up until he got his adult teeth looking like he was a fighter. He looked like Rocky. I mean, he just missing a tooth and 2 teeth, his 2 front teeth. And yeah, you feel that pain. You know that pain's not going to be for the rest of his life, right? As a parent, you understand that. He doesn't understand that, but you understand that. And you feel that pain, and that's what Jesus is feeling. He feels that pain with us, even though it may be temporary. I can tell you from experience that sometimes that is a great consolation, to know that I have a Savior who has entered into my pain, that the tears in my eyes are matched with tears in his. Here's the second word. Anger. Verse 33 says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. The word for deeply moved in the Greek is really not able to be translated into our English language. It's embry meomi. It really means he was indignant. He was indignant. Some scholars say that the best translation is that he snorted, almost like an animal snorting prior to charging prey. Jesus moves towards the grave, and in verse 43, he shouts at death with a loud voice. If you were writing the soundtrack for this story, it would move from this quiet, somber, Jesus is a friend of mine, or Jesus, oh, what a friend I have in Jesus with Mary and Martha as he consoles them, into this theme of Rocky. Like it's just this, he goes into warrior mode, into fighter mode. And as much as I do need a friend, I also need a conquering hero. I need a weeping friend who will understand the pain and weep with me, but I also need a conquering hero. And by the way, I'll just add this in here. It's okay to be angry at death. Right? Again, we have this weird concept of death and emotions as Christians, and what we can feel or what we're supposed to feel and what we're not supposed to feel, and all of these things we try to sugarcoat and make things super easy, or we try to just kind of cover things over and move on and stuff down the emotions. But I just want to remind you that it's okay to be angry at death. Jesus was. To feel hatred at suffering is okay. To feel hatred at cancer is okay. Jesus did. The world is not supposed to be like this, and we're not supposed to ever get used to it. I think there's something about us where we just are like, well, it is what it is. This is the life that we're a part of. This is the world we live in. No, we don't have to get used to it. We can be angry at it. We can be mad that sin entered this world and brought with it death and destruction. Let's not whitewash all of the Hallmark Channel realities as a necessary rhythm of life. Or, well, we all have to say goodbye sometime. Stoics always want to say that about life. But when you're standing beside the grave of a child or a wife that was cut down in the prime of their life, there's something that rises up within us and says that is not right. That emotion is a valid emotion. Anger in the face of injustice and suffering is right. Jesus is about to go into battle with the most hated, most dreadful enemy ever known by mankind, and in so doing, he's going to offer something that no other religious leaders, no political leader, no scientist has ever been able to offer. I mentioned this last week, that we kind of live in this time, in this culture, where it's become accepted wisdom to say that all religions are basically the same, right? That all generally lead to the same place. They may have different names for God and encourage different rituals, but the core of them is the same. The challenge to that is Jesus promised something that no other religious or political leader in the world has ever been able to promise, much less make good on, and that is to erase death. Only one person in history has ever gone into the darkness of the grave and walked out by his own power. And now he's standing there in front of Mary and Martha, and he's mad. He's mad at death. And he says, I am the resurrection and the life. And he says to them, do you believe this? Which leads me to the third word, truth. Jesus makes a promise in verse 25. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, do you believe this? Of course, this doesn't mean that Christians never die. Of course, that's not true, because the whole point of this story is that Lazarus is dead, right? He died. He believed in Jesus, but now he's dead. In fact, he dies twice. He died the first time. Jesus raises him from the dead, but Lazarus isn't still alive. I think maybe we have this picture of Lazarus like the knight in the Last Crusade, where he's just holed up in a cave somewhere. He just can't die. No, that's not how this works. Lazarus died again. Which, by the way, I kind of like how John Chris, I don't know if you've ever heard him, he's a comedian. He says this: we love to talk about how awesome this story is for Mary and Martha and us. But you know who this story wasn't awesome for? Lazarus. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, which means he's in heaven for 4 days. He's moved into his mansion. We're not getting into John Chris theology here, but he's getting the furniture arranged in his mansion just like he wants it, and all of a sudden he gets a knock on the door, and when he opens it, there's this sheepish angel standing there saying, yeah, Lazarus, we're going to have to send you back. We don't normally do this, but the big guy says it's under special circumstances. Lazarus was a follower of Jesus, and he died twice, which doesn't sound awesome. And so Jesus' statement clearly doesn't mean that no Christian ever dies. Like, it doesn't mean we don't die. What Jesus meant is that for his followers, death would not really be death. Not in the final sense, not in the eternal sense. And one day, like Lazarus, his followers are going to wake up from death like they're waking up from a bad dream. And I like the imagery of a dream. We're not talking about some pie-in-the-sky consolation that God gives us for our troubles. We're talking about God actually undoing the damage that our sin has caused. That all of that pain and all of that suffering becomes untrue. Tim Keller used to say that about once every year or so he'd have a reoccurring nightmare. And in this reoccurring nightmare, his wife actually was flattered by it. But in this nightmare, he said his wife dies. Something has happened to her, Tim said, and in my dream, I'm desperately trying to figure out how to go on in life without her. My wife says that she's flattered because the reoccurrence of this dream means that her death is obviously my greatest fear. But let me tell you something really weird, he said. I almost like having that nightmare now because the first minute after I wake up is so unbelievably great. To wake up and say, oh my, it was only a bad dream. Everything bad I thought I was living through has come untrue. It's not like I'm awakened just to have someone give me something to make the pain better. It's not like when I awake, someone says, sorry, your wife died, here's another wife, like a consolation. No, I'm waking up. The dream itself becomes untrue. And it's this wonderful feeling to say it is morning. It was only a bad dream. Keller then says, do you know what Jesus Christ is saying when he says, I am the resurrection? He's not saying that he will give us a nicer place, like some kind of consolation for our pain. No, he is going to make everything that happened in our pain seem like a bad dream. He'll make everything bad come untrue. Jesus Christ is not giving us consolation, he's giving us resurrection. For those who live and believe in Jesus, this is what he promises. Jesus then asked the question to Martha and to us, do you believe this? Do you believe it? Billy Graham said shortly before he died, one fine day you will hear that Billy Graham is dead. Don't believe it. I'll be more alive than ever. I will just have changed addresses. In verse 38, Jesus goes on to raise Lazarus. It's this incredible scene. Jesus prays to the Father, and he says, do this, Father, so they will believe that you sent me. And then Jesus yells Lazarus' name down into the grave, and suddenly there was a commotion down there, and Lazarus walks out. I mean, could you even imagine that moment? One pastor famously said, it's a good thing that Jesus used Lazarus' first name, otherwise every dead man in that cemetery would have come out. And by the way, one little detail that we might overlook is the fact that Lazarus was now dead for 4 days. Like, it was on the fourth day that Lazarus was raised. The reason that is significant is Jews believed that the spirit hung around the body sometimes for about 3 days just to make sure there wasn't a misdiagnosis. But on the 4th day, when decomposition had really set in and the body moves into rigor mortis and really started to stink, that's when the spirit was gone for good. In other words, in the Jewish mind, Lazarus was not just partially dead, he was all the way dead. And yet, Jesus calls him back to life, like he's waking him up from a sleep or from a dream. Jesus then says, take off his grave clothes, and they all rejoice and marvel at Jesus' power. And you might think the story is over, like, yay, Jesus, you raised him from the dead. But it's not. This is where the real story begins. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, they hear about this miracle. They had heard about other miracles, and they weren't sure what to think about them. But when they heard about this miracle, this was the final straw. So the religious leaders call a special council together, and they decide that this is the final straw and that they don't know how this happened. They don't know if it was a trick or Jesus is, just raising the dead by the power of Satan. But this miracle, they figure, is going to give people false hope and give Jesus way too much authority in the land. And verse 53 says, so from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. This marks the turning point in the Gospel of John where Jesus starts his march to the cross. And in less than 2 weeks, they will have killed him. It's not accidental that John kind of puts these two stories together because he's showing us that in order to break up Lazarus' funeral, Jesus had to commence his own. Leads us to the fourth and final word, which is grace. In order for us to never die, Jesus had to die in our place. God has said since the beginning, right, from the beginning of the Garden of Eden at the dawn of time, that the penalty of sin, the consequence of sin, is death. Sin separates us from God, and God is the source of life. Imagine if the earth rebelled from its orbit, right, and just began to drift off into space. Death would be inevitable. That's what sin is like. It separated us from God, and it put upon us the curse of death. The gospel, the central Christian message, is that on the cross, God made Jesus, who knew no sin, to become sin for us, a transfer of this consequence of sin onto him. God placed my sin upon Jesus. He placed your sin upon Jesus. As the prophet Isaiah said, the punishment that brought us peace would be put upon him so that by his stripes I could be healed. Jesus can be the resurrection for me because he first became death for me. I've heard this story told in the explanation of the cross before. Maybe you've heard it as well, but it's about a dad who is driving down the freeway, and he's got his 3-year-old little daughter in the back in the car seat, and all of a sudden there's a yellow jacket flying around in the car. And when she suddenly sees it, she began to scream, "Daddy, Daddy, a bee." She was terrified of bees, and her dad knew that she was actually allergic to the bee sting. So the dad rolled down the windows, and he was trying to shoo the yellow jacket out, and we've all been there. Usually in my house, it's a spider in South Texas, but whatever. I mean, bee in this scenario. And so he couldn't get it. He couldn't get the bee out of the car, and so he kind of panics. He pulls the car over. He gets out. He jumps in the back seat, and he traps the bee on a window. The little girl starts to scream as she pulls his hand off, and the bee starts flying around again, and she's like, "Daddy, Daddy, the bee, the bee." But the dad said, "Sweetheart, that bee cannot hurt you anymore." And he opens up his palm, and he shows her the bee's stinger lodged in the palm of his hand. On the cross, Jesus took the stinger of death into his hands, so that when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, there would be no stinger left for me. Paul says it this way, "O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory?" The stinger is gone because the grave has been conquered. Jesus, by his death, put death to death, and now offers resurrection life to all who will believe in him. Do you believe this? Which brings us back to what Jesus said that the whole point of this encounter was. Verse 15, so that you may believe. Believe what? That Jesus is who he says he is, even when life feels confusing sometimes, and you don't know what he's doing, even when things don't make sense to us. In verse 42, as Jesus is praying to the Father to raise Lazarus through him, he makes his aim even clearer. He says, "Do this, Father, that they may believe that you sent me." Imagine that you had been one of Jesus' disciples on that day, and you heard about Jesus pray that prayer, and you might even be thinking, "Jesus, are you kidding me? Like, you're telling me that you engineered this entire event just so that we could understand who the Father is?" Right? Is it even possible that you would put these poor women through all of this pain and all of this heartache, cause all of this confusion and grief? And Jesus would say, absolutely. Absolutely. And so Jesus, through this story, gives us a picture of what the Father is. Kind of the rule of thumb for the Gospel of John is this: like Son, like Father. Not like Father, like Son, like Father, that what you see in the Son is the Father. In fact, Jesus says it himself. He says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Whatever Jesus is like, the Father is like. Because Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, the exact imprint of his nature. That means that is who the Father is. And there's some who, as we listen to this story and we walk through this, we say, yeah, but the consequences or the things that I'm experiencing, my pain is actually been caused by me. It's my fault. My pain is my fault. I brought it upon myself. My marriage is in shambles. Why? Because of me. My kid hates me because of me, how I treated them, how I ruled over them. I lost my job because of me. And I would just say none of that matters as it relates to how the Father feels about you. When the prodigal son ran away from the Father into the far country, the Father still stood at the gates every day, longingly looking out, waiting for his son to return. The decision to leave was his son's decision. And with broken heart and tears in his eyes, he waits longingly for the son to return. Not to reprimand him for all of his poor choices, but to embrace him and to put him back in his household. Jesus showed us how much the Father loves us, so much that he'd send his Son to take sin's curse in our place. And now he promises that all who will live and believe in him will never die. Death for believers will never have the fatally bitter taste that it does for so many others. One day soon, and very soon, as the song goes, this whole veil of tears we call life will end in resurrection. And we will see that Jesus wasn't absent after all. And we'll see that life isn't meaningless chaos. Yes, sometimes it seems as though Jesus delays. But I would ask the question, are there things that he wants to teach us about God in the midst of our pain that we couldn't learn any other way? Does he cause the pain in our life? I don't believe so. I don't believe so. But I do think he redeems that pain for circumstances that point to the Father. You might be thinking, well, why? Why do it this way? I don't know. I don't know that I can fully answer that, but I do know that everything in our Bible teaches us that it is this way. It doesn't totally make sense to me why Jesus made the disciples wait until the third day for his resurrection. I don't know. I don't get all of that. I don't understand all of that. But I do know this, in part, it may be because this is what our lives often feel like right now. But sometimes it feels like we live in that second day, that terrible Saturday. This place of waiting. That's where we are now, where we say, like Mary and Martha, "Where are you, God?" in the midst of this dark time. But there's an empty tomb in Jerusalem that assures us that he hasn't forgotten, and that although we may feel like we are in a pointless Saturday of suffering, Resurrection Sunday is just around the corner. And in the meantime, we know he stands by the grave of our disappointment, weeping with us, praying with us. Paul says, with groanings and sighs too deep even to articulate into human words. Which brings us back to the central question: do you believe this? Because if you do, the promise that is attached is you shall never die. Not for eternity. This is the promise for everyone. Jesus did what he did for everyone, but we have to take it for ourselves. We don't automatically get it. John opened his gospel by saying in John chapter 1, verse 12, "But to as many received him, to them he gave the power to become the children of God, to those who believe on his name." This is the thesis of the Gospel of John. Every story he tells is to urge us to receive Jesus for ourselves, because only those who receive Jesus get the benefits of the promise. So you ask, well, what does that mean to receive him? I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that we live a life that makes us good enough to earn the title. That's not receiving, that's earning. And receiving him doesn't mean just going through the motions or like a church ritual like baptism or confirmation. Those may have their place. I'm not saying those are terrible things, of course not, but technically they aren't receiving. Those are accomplishing. Those are things that we do. It's going through a checklist and marking off all of the things that we think are necessary in order to earn the title Son of God, or son and daughters of the Most High God. Receiving him means exactly what you think it means. It means you receive him like a gift. Use this illustration at times. That when someone brings and presents you a gift, you don't stick your hands in your pocket and say, just lay that down. Just put it down there. I'll get to it when I get to it. No, if somebody comes to you and presents a gift, you put your hands out and you receive it. You take a posture of receptivity and a vulnerable state where you're saying, yes, I receive that gift. And so my question to all of us, you can say, well, Pastor Ryan, I don't know why you're preaching this message to us. As I look around the room, most of us have received the gift of salvation. We have surrendered our life to Christ. And I would just say to that, I'm not so sure. Not that I'm questioning people's salvation. I'm just saying that there is this prevalence that exists where we say, if I just go through the motions, if I just do this, if I just attend, if I just give, if I just serve, then I will be in right relationship with Christ. And I would just say that is way more complicated than it needs to be. It's simply just receiving the free gift of God's grace in our life. And in most churches, in most circumstances, after a message like this, we would say, now we're going to give you the opportunity to respond. And I just don't believe that our receptivity to the free gift of salvation has to come out of a plea. Instead, I feel like if you've found yourself in this place of, you know what, I'm just doing all of the things, but But I've never actually just said to Christ, I surrender to you. I surrender to your ways. It's as simple as that. Not the easiest thing you will ever do in this lifetime, but it is the simplest decision you can make. And so I want to encourage you today, if that's you, that you would just make that decision, that you would begin today receiving the gift of salvation from the one who went to the cross and took the consequences of your sin. And through repentance, we say, God, I surrender to you. Let's pray.